So I'm a professor in Earth and Atmospheric Sciences. I am trained as a meteorologist, and I work a lot on climate change. I'm also a faculty director at the Atkinson Center for a Sustainable Future. And my job there is to get people working together across disciplines at Cornell to have an impact outside. So we love to work with the Cornell Extension, for example, as well as with other elements of Cornell to make sure that the research we do on Cornell's campus actually has an impact on people's life. So that's my job within the Atkinson Center. Now, what I'm going to talk to you today about is this UN climate report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Specifically, the task we were given was to look at 1.5 degrees. So I was a lead author on that report and very involved in the process. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about what the process is to try to produce one of those reports, maybe put a little bit of a human face on that, and then talk about the science. Now, I understand some of you are probably climate change connoisseurs, and some of you are not. I'm not going to talk too much about the science of climate change. I teach it all the time, so I'm very happy to talk more about it afterwards. I'm going to assume that you're kind of knowledgeable about what's going on with the climate change issue, and I'll talk about what's new and what I think people don't always understand there. So as an author on this report, I was actually asked to go out and present the report because it represents thousands of hours of work by international scientists. And so you'll see here on both these slides, these are the official IPCC slides. And then, so I will mostly talk officially about what this group of scientists decided. It's not necessarily my opinion of the science, but it's going to be the consensus view of the science. And I'll talk about how we reached that. So this is the text that we were asked by the UN, basically the group that's meeting right now in Poland, the COP, under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. We were asked to go after this question, okay? And I'm going to read it to you. It's a very long question. That's an IPCC special report on the impacts of global warming of 1.5 degrees C above pre-industrial levels and related global greenhouse gas emission pathways in the context of strengthening the global response to the threat of climate change, sustainable development, and efforts to eradicate poverty. Okay? So normally the IPCC just talks about climate change, but this report talks about everything, really, right? We're going to eradicate poverty, have sustainable development. This is a very, very cross-disciplinary report. And that's different from what the IPCC usually does. And that has a few implications. But it does something that I think is really important that people often don't understand when they talk about climate change. And that is that, here in the US, we have already developed. Okay? We have not developed in a very sustainable way, but we have developed, and we have very little truly extreme poverty here. We haven't solved that problem, but we are in much better position than, for example, in sub-Saharan Africa or something like that, okay? We have developed. We have eradicated most of our poverty, and we have done it by emitting a lot of CO2. I mean, not just a ton of CO2, but lots of tons of CO2. Our whole way of life is dependent on cheap fossil fuels emitting CO2. Clearing land, emitting CO2. Almost everything we do emits CO2, and that CO2 is accumulating in the atmosphere. This is the problem, okay? So this report actually puts at the crux eradication of poverty and sustainable development versus climate change, okay? Here in the US, we often think of it as business versus environment, and that can be true. I mean, we need to move from this unsustainable development pathway to a sustainable development pathway. But the rest of the world that has not yet eradicated poverty, has not yet achieved our standard of living, they want to. I mean, why wouldn't they want to, right? I mean, we have a really nice standard of life. They want to switch over. They want to develop and eradicate poverty, okay? And have our lifestyle. The problem is if they emit as much CO2 as we did, okay, we got real problems, okay? In the future, most of the CO2 that is going to be emitted already today, most of the CO2 is emitted by developing countries, not by developed countries, okay? So we need to switch over as fast as possible to more sustainable ways to sustain our lifestyle, and get those super cheap so that we can propagate that technologies and those methods to the rest of the world that wants our lifestyle, so that we don't block them from eradicating poverty and developing, okay? This is the problem, that it's eradication of poverty and development versus climate change. And this is especially important when we look at really low climate targets like 1.5 degrees C, okay? That's a very low climate target. The other thing that people don't always understand, and it's so human not to understand, is the sheer time scale that it's going to take us to solve the problem. It has taken us 250 years to figure out how to get our life cycle, or our lifestyle the way it is. And we've done it by emitting CO2, which has accumulated in the atmosphere. It's going to take us at least 50 to 100 years to get off that CO2 and deal with the climate change impacts. If we're lucky, 50 to 100 years, okay? It is a really long and huge problem. It is not a small problem. And so when you talk about, solving climate change, this is a problem we're going to be dealing with, okay, for a long time. So those are the things I find people don't always understand about the climate change problem. It's not something we can fix anytime soon. We got to keep moving and really try to address this eradication of poverty versus climate change. Now, climate change is a problem that we're not dealing with very well yet. But I do want to be positive here. We actually have, in absolute numbers, reduced the number of people living in extreme poverty. So here, this is 1820 here. This is 2015. This is billions of people. The green line is how many people we have on the planet. It's exploding right now. We're at over 7 billion. The red part is how many people are living in extreme poverty. That started dropping, say, in 1970. Okay, at the point when we really started blowing up in terms of our CO2 emissions, we were successful, and we are successful now in eradicating poverty. People across the world are actually getting wealthier. So there is good news, okay? We have not yet stopped the emission of CO2, though. So this is the report that just came out, and hopefully you've seen some of the press coverage. There's quite a bit of press coverage on this report. The IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, it is jointly organized by the UN Environment Program, so it's a UN report, as well as the World Meteorological Organization, which nobody's ever heard of, but meteorologists. So they're the ones that put together all the weather data so that countries talk to each other. Okay, so it's very natural that they were also involved. The important thing about this report is that scientists write the report. The governments put together an outline of the questions they want addressed, basically, and then they approve the summary for policymakers line by line. But the scientists write every word of it. This is different than, for example, the National Climate Assessment that's done in the US, which is written by the government scientists, okay? So for this report, there were 91 authors from 40 countries. So I was one of these 91 authors. There were 6 from the United States chosen. There were, the way this is done is you're nominated, say, by Cornell, nominated me, up to the US level. Then the US program on climate change pushes our names forward, whichever names they want to, forward to the IPCC, and then they choose the lead authors. So there were over 1,000 nominations of experts for this report, and 91 were chosen for the report from 40 different countries. Because this report is so broad, and you want to make sure you bring in all the experts, we also brought in contributing authors, another 130 contributing authors. This particular report, focusing on 1.5, that's a very ambitious climate target. There's actually very little scientific literature on going as low as 1.5. And so there had to be new studies to do that, to look at that. And then, of course, there's, with time, scientists publish studies. So There were 6,000 new studies assessed in the report, and over 1,000 reviewers, and 40,000 comments that we had to deal with, okay? So every comment we have to answer and modify the document to explain. So the process is very convoluted. This is an assessment report. It's not a review. It's not my personal opinion. It has a very formal process here. So what happens is there's a meeting that scopes out what should be in the report, and then the governments at the panel level approve the outline, okay? And so they tell us what topics we're allowed to talk about or not talk about, basically, in the report. Then the authors are nominated. Then there's 3 versions of the text, each of which is formally reviewed by experts as well as government. All the comments have to be scientific or saying that's not in the outline, so you shouldn't talk about that. The government can't say that's a politically unacceptable statement, please remove it. They have to say that does not reflect the underlying peer-reviewed scientific literature, okay? So they have to make the arguments as if they're scientific arguments. Then at the end, after all these reviews, okay, and we have 4 lead author meetings, so the 91 of us were flying all over the world. Someone calculates the carbon footprint of the IPCC. We do offset it, but still, I mean, you can do your best, but really much better not to emit any fossil fuels. Anyway, we go to these different places. We have a week-long meeting where we revise the text. It's a ton of work. At the beginning, I might have known maybe 2 or 3 people in my area. At the end, I probably know 40 people really well, okay, because we have worked together very intensely. And it's a very cross-disciplinary group. And when you work cross-disciplinary, you use a different language, okay, and you have to learn the different language. Then it's about 400, in Word, it's about 400 pages. Then we took that and we reduced it to 30 pages that were the summary for policymakers, basically. And then that document is reviewed line by the governments and approved as reflecting the underlying scientific literature. So the idea that anything that's in an IPCC report has not been highly debated is let's just say wrong, okay? Because the governments read every paper we cite. And if we don't cite a paper, they point that out too, just to say this is the underlying literature. This is very well debated. There are certain countries, of course, fossil fuel-driven countries, that will make sure we don't overstate anything in terms of the climate change impacts. And there are other countries that are highly impacted by climate change that will make sure we do not underestimate any impact, okay? So you've got all these forces going on. So the scientists, it's not just one study, it has to be reproducible by many people. That's what an assessment report is. It's very much a consensus report. Then that final 30-page document is line by line approved by the governments during the session that I was at this session in October. It was supposed to be done between Monday to Friday. At first we started out with, I would almost say like bankers hours, right? Not to insult any bankers, but 10 to 1, 3 to 7. And this is a UN event, so you've got the simultaneous translation with these little earpieces. So 5 UN languages simultaneously translated. So they know that these reports tend to not be approved till very late. Let's just put it that way. So they already asked in advance that on Wednesday there be extra interpreters so that we could go for an evening session, 8 to 10:30. On Thursday, we had made so little progress. On Thursday, there was added an 11 p.m. to 2 a.m. slot. And then we started up again at 8 a.m. also. Friday night, we went straight through all night to 3 p.m. on Saturday, okay? So it's very contentious. Every line has to be approved here. So here's a picture of me at the front of this huge room with hundreds of people in it. I'm speaking here. These are the co-chairs kind of directing us, and here's some other authors. And I'm coming up front to describe what we're trying to say in this particular headline statement or bullet point, okay? Then we read the statements, we go through and we approve them. But really what happens is the countries I'm not sure there was any statement that was approved this first time, okay? So the countries would have what they call interventions. They would, hit a little button. And they'd have an intervention and they'd say, we don't like how this is phrased because of this, this, and this, okay? So the scientists, we had reached consensus within ourselves, but then we have to translate it to layperson's terms and do that accurately, okay? And these guys are scientists. They have to give scientific reasons, but they're also diplomats. And so often their suggestions were more clear, to be honest. You're like, oh, yeah, I see what you're saying. Okay, all right, let's take that and we'll rewrite that. Of course, some governments might have had a political agenda in their interventions as well. Let's just put it that way. Trying to push back on the science, both directions. Like I said, they're pushing both ways. And the scientists have to decide, what does the underlying literature say? Okay, no, that's not true. Yes, that is accurate. If you think that's clearer, I can go with that, right? So this is what the authors are doing. So the scientists write all the statements. They have to be good with every sentence. The governments have the right to either approve or disapprove each sentence as reflecting the underlying scientific literature. All right, so 3 p.m. on Saturday, we are so glad it's over, okay, after 2 nights of not sleeping. Here I am. This is the full team that got the Summary for Policymakers through. And we were very excited. We pretty much got all the science through that we wanted to get through the process. And so that was really nice. So that tells you something about the process. And at the end of it, like I said, you're pretty bonded with these other people. Even some of the government negotiators we were pretty bonded with after working through the night a couple nights. A lot of the governments really just want the underlying science to be represented. So that's really nice. And then there's some governments that have a political agenda, okay? So if we come back to the text here, and I'm going to tell you more about the report. And an important thing about this report is it was actually requested by the governments. It's the first report that's ever been requested by the governments for the IPCC. And what they requested was to look at 1.5 degrees C. And it was really the countries that will cease to exist under climate change that made a passionate appeal at the same time as the Paris Agreement. They made a passionate appeal that can we look and see if we can get under 1.5, okay? And a lot of these countries will cease to exist even at 1.5, okay? They're just low-lying island states. They don't have enough land above, a couple feet, so they will likely go underwater even at 1.5. The scientists previously, in the previous assessment reports, we have a lot of assessment reports, we had not considered anything lower than 2, and even 2 was considered quite controversial. And that's because it's so hard to stay under 2 or 1.5, okay? So there was almost no literature looking at 1.5. We were also asked in this report to look at 1.5 versus 2, because 2 had been addressed in other reports. Okay, so it's a very particular things we were supposed to address in this report. And it's an assessment report, but there's a lot of other reports underway. There's one on climate change, oceans, and cryosphere, another special report focused on that issue. There's also a special report on land, basically, going on right now. So we were asked not to look at those. We were just looking at the 1.5, how to reach a really low climate target. In addition, the next set of full assessment reports is underway already here. So these are the 6th assessment reports, and I was involved in the 5th assessment reports. These go on every 7 years. Look at the full literature. For the 1.5 report, we were really looking at a part of that. All right, so now I'm going to talk about the results of that. So the first section was understanding 1.5 and where we are today, and this was the part that I was more involved in. The important thing to recognize is that we've already seen 1 degree C of warming up to today from human activities, okay, since pre-industrial. And this already has consequences for people. If we continue at this rate, we will reach 1.5 in 2040. So in 12 years, we'll be at 1.5. But past emissions alone do not commit us to over 1.5 degrees C. So it is physically possible. So if we want to see this graphically, if you're a graphical kind of person, here's 1960. out to 2100. It's usually where we consider the climate problem, although it's not going to be ended then, but we're just trying to hit targets at 2100 and trying to keep temperatures low. Here we are. Here's the mean of the observations up to 2017. Here's 1.5, and you can see we're going to cross by about 2040 if we continue the way we are today. And then here we look at a couple very simple scenarios to try to figure out what you'd have to do to stop, okay? Let's see, what I want to point out here is this is the CO2 emissions right now. I think this is 1970 to today, 2017. And this is how it's increasing in billions of tons of CO2 per year, okay? It's radically increasing here. We have to basically, with that same slope, turn it down and stop emitting CO2 or have a net zero CO2 by 2050 in order to reach a 1.5 degree target, okay? Very ambitious, right? We have to change all the processes that are going on. And the important thing to remember is whatever climate target we hit is going to be the cumulative CO2 emissions up to that point, up to the peak point. And then there's a little bit of modification because of non-CO2 radiative forcing here, okay? And the importance of this is these are on the same scale in terms of their importance for warming. Let's just put it that way. That even if you hit a 1.5 target, which is a very ambitious CO2 target, most of the radiative forcing comes from CO2, not from non-CO2 agents. So it's really a focus on CO2, although we want to cut the non-CO2 radiative forcing constituents as well. But the most important is the CO2. And we can see that in the radiative forcings from today. So radiative forcing, if you don't know, that's just the energy balance at the top of the atmosphere. That's what's driving the warming. We just have we call it radiative forcing, but it's just the imbalance in the energy that is causing an accumulation of heat in the climate system. I think I'll skip that. Projected climate change potential impacts, associated risks. So here, one of the important things that came out of this report is actually the scientists took a look at what's happening, say, today at 1.0 versus 0.5. We can use historical records, right? Look back, say, 1950s, we were only at 0.5. We can take a look at those observations and say, what was the impact? And then using models, look at 1.0 versus 1.5, et cetera, okay? And so look at, 0.5 degrees C, who cares, right? It matters. That's the bottom line, is we can tell that it matters from the observational record as well as model results. So at 1.5 versus 2 degrees C, we're going to have less extreme weather where people live, including extreme heat as well as extreme precipitation. So extreme precipitation means really heavy rain events, maybe causing flooding, and drought events. Both of them will increase in frequency. Not everywhere, of course, but if we think about globally what's going to happen, that's what we expect. In addition, if we keep the temperatures at 1.5 versus 2 degrees, both of them very ambitious goals, the sea level rise at 2100 will be 10 centimeters lower, right? So, 3 inches, 4 inches, somewhere in that range, okay? Now, that may not sound like much, but if you're living right on the coast, that matters a huge amount, especially during storms, right? Storm surge is when you really care about the sea level rise. It's 10 million fewer people exposed to the risk of rising sea. The impacts of global warming, you have lower impact on biodiversity and species, smaller reductions in yields of our main crops, and half the population that would be exposed at 2 degrees C would be exposed at 1.5 degrees to water shortages, okay? Lower risk to fisheries, and the several 100 million fewer people exposed to climate-related risks and susceptibility to poverty, okay? So the people who are at risk, the very poor and vulnerable, would be less at risk at 2 degrees versus 1.5 degrees. So we could tell, even at this very small difference, 0.5 degrees C, it doesn't sound like much. It's millions of people fewer are impacted if we can keep it to 1.5 versus 2. But this is true at every 0.5 degrees. It only gets worse as you get to higher temperatures, okay? Like I said, 1.5 and 2 would be very hard to reach to keep the temperatures below. Any increase is going to have more impact on people. We want to keep the temperatures as low as possible. The IPCC uses these reasons for concern slides here. And they did this in the last report. And really, what it is here is the white, yellow, red, and then purple. I can't see the purple so well. And then this is temperature here. And as you go from pre-industrial, that's white, no change. Yellow is we can start to detect the change. Red is really getting really bad, and purple is really bad impacts. And so in the last IPCC, we went all the way up to 5 degrees, because that's, you could see here, this is from the last IPCC, pre-industrial, 2100. This is kind of business as usual, that red line, so we would reach 4.5 or 5 degrees C if we do business as usual. And then this is the 2-degree scenario, that blue scenario, which is really radical changes in our energy system, okay? So these are kind of our choices, and we're making these choices right now, you can think of it. And then in this report, we were asked to look at trying to keep things below even 1.5. And there's a couple things that you have to think about, and one is that we're going to spend a lot of money today, okay, to change from business as usual down to, say, 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees. But it's not us who are going to see the benefits from that climate mitigation. It's what happens at 2100, right, that really matters. So this is this really long time scale of the problem, that we have to spend the money now to help people in the future. And that's what I often find people don't understand. It's so hard for humans to think about 100 years from now, really. And that's the problem with the climate change question, is because it's not natural for humans to think that, and politicians don't care, right? I mean, 2 to 4 degrees, that's what they care about. But it's really hard for people to care about, it's my grandchildren, right, that we're really impacting. And we have to pay for that now. We have to do all that changes in our lifestyle and put in the mitigation and everything now to save people at 2100. Anything we can do lower than 4.5 is really good, because 4.5 is kind of where we're headed if we didn't do anything. So this report, we really focused on the lower climate targets, right? We were looking at 1.5 versus 2. And the most threatened ecosystems are the coral reefs and some of the Arctic regions. Those are really threatened at even very small increases in temperatures. Those are the most threatened. We have to worry about extreme weather events. It's very hard to attribute any particular hurricane to climate change. Of course, we've always had hurricanes. But what we expect under climate change is more intense hurricanes, okay? So, all the hurricanes we've been seeing in the Caribbean, we can't say those are definitely from climate change, but that's exactly what we're worried about, okay? Those are the kind of things that we really worry about. And then, the global aggregate results and, the potential for some kind of singular impact where a whole ecosystem is lost, for example. In this report, there was more looking at these lower temperatures and a focus on that. Let me keep moving here. What can we do to get to 1.5? Why do I say it's so ambitious? All right, I've already showed you that the CO2 is increasing all the time, and we have to change the direction. What does that mean? So to limit warming to 1.5, CO2 emissions have to fall by about 45% by 2030. In 12 years, they have to fall by 45% from 2010 levels, okay? Now, if we only were shooting for 2 degrees, that would be only a 20% change. But we're not talking about only just places like here, rich, technologically advanced places like New York State or Cornell. We're talking about developing countries that are living in poverty, right? The whole global system has to cut CO2 emissions. So the obligation is even heavier on us, okay? We got to cut even faster. And it's unclear if we can really do that. We have to reach net zero CO2 emissions by 2050, okay, globally, not just us, globally, okay? We got to lead, right? We are the rich, developed, and technologically advanced part. Now, reducing the CO2 emissions, I already said, that really we're doing it for the future, for what happens at 2100. But there are benefits today. And a lot of this report was really focusing on the ways that you could synergize with sustainable development. For example, fossil fuel emissions are terrible for air quality. So you save people's lives today if you get off fossil fuels and convert to solar or wind, which all of a sudden are actually really quite cheap. So all of a sudden it's quite possible to convert the energy sectors to something more sustainable if we push hard enough. In addition, in the agricultural fields, you can get more carbon into the soils. This reduces the carbon in the atmosphere, and it also makes the soils more fertile. This is positive, okay? Reforestation, getting people off the lands, allowing the land to reforest. Right there, more carbon goes into the land and biodiversity, okay? So there's a lot of co-benefits, and so we really try to emphasize the co-benefits and the immediate health benefits to trying to solve this climate problem. Limiting warming to 1.5 would require modifications on an unprecedented scale. We've never done this kind of changes before. We need deep emission cuts in all sectors. I've already said we've got wind and solar, we've got some sustainable energies, but that's not the only sector. It's the most important sector. Energy is the most important sector, but we have to convert all of industry over, transportation, agriculture, forestry, land use, all those things have to cut CO2 emissions. Those we don't have substitutes for right now. There are a range of technologies, and we probably have to do more than one of them, right? We got to switch over so quickly. Behavioral changes are really, really important. In fact, the only way to really do this problem well is if everybody switches over. So we have to give up some of our lifestyle, to be honest, to get to a 1.5. Stop driving cars, stop flying, stop buying things, eat low on the food chain, stop using land, right? The agriculture sector is very hard to mitigate. We need to do all these behavioral changes. We need a lot of increased investment in the low carbon options. We don't have substitutes right now for a lot of the areas that we need the substitutes for, okay? So we have this progress in renewables. We need it to be mirrored in other sectors so that we can convert over. We also probably need to start developing new technologies to take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. Like I said, you can use soil carbon sequestration in agriculture, and it increases your fertility, or reforestation. Those are all methods to take the CO2 out of the atmosphere, and they make a lot of sense to do. They're not going to be big enough. We're going to have to do something larger scale. The method we have right now that is used in these models to get to the 1.5 is something called bioenergy carbon capture and sequestration. So basically, to reach some of these climate targets, you take most of the Midwest and put it into bioenergy. So you're growing some kind of crop, like a better corn, that you convert to ethanol that's actually carbon, taking up carbon instead of not being carbon neutral like ethanol. Anyway, so you'd have to develop a new kind of technology for the bioenergy, burn it. Okay, the plants take up CO2. Okay, so you use photosynthesis to take up the CO2 in the atmosphere. You burn it, and you take all the CO2, and you put it into the ground. Okay, so that's bioenergy carbon capture and sequestration. And most of the scenarios that reach 1.5 or 2 use that technology. And there's incredible environmental problems with that. I mean, like I said, you'd have to take most of the Midwest of the US into that kind of production. So you'd have to take it out of food production. Instead, it has to be bioenergy production. And the water quality, the land constraints, the biodiversity issues, it becomes a really big issue. And not just for us, right? This is food security. We'd have to do this all over the world in places where food security is not very good, okay? So this is a really, really hard task. And we may choose not to go after the really low climate targets because of the environmental impacts of, for example, carbon dioxide removal, if we don't have better technology. So we need to be thinking about better technologies. The other thing is that at the same time as the Paris Agreement, where the countries agreed to try to shoot for a 2 degrees C, the countries voluntarily made pledges. And it was acknowledged at the time that those pledges were not enough to get to 2 degrees C. So if you take those pledges and you extrapolate them, they're probably consistent with a 3 degrees C rise. Now, this may sound very depressing to you, but to me this sounds great, okay? Because up to this time, I'm thinking 4 degrees C, 4.5, okay? There's no way we can get any lower. And all of a sudden, because of the advances in renewables and this new energy in climate change, we were only talking about 3. So 3 to me is a huge success. It's going to be a lot harder to hit 1.5 or 2, but you know, I'm an optimistic person, and I'm very glad we're not shooting for 4 or 4.5. Avoiding a warming of more than 1.5 would require substantial CO2 emissions before 2030. So basically, we got to be working right now if we want to turn things around. We have to be working extremely hard. So this just is an illustration of kind of global emission pathways to talk about how radically this would change things. Remember, we're going up right now in CO2. This is 2010. This is 2100. We're going up right now. We've got to right away flatten it and start going down if we want to reach 1.5. These blue pathways are pathways that don't overshoot 1.5, okay? And if you overshoot 1.5, that means the CO2 goes up higher and it comes down. So implicitly, you have some method to remove the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. That's that BECS stuff, okay? And then the gray ones are ones that have overshoot, have more overshoot. And you got to cut all the other emissions as well. It's really hard to cut nitrous oxide emissions, for example, because so much comes in a land use, land cover change. You got to feed 10 billion people and have bioenergy. Same thing with methane. You can get rid of some of the fossil fuel sources of methane, great, but you can't get rid of all the land use, land cover change sources of methane, which are considerable. So they talk about some different pathways, and the first pathway is a scenario in which we reach 1.5 rather easily. So this is CO2 emissions from today out to 2100 again. So the gray is the fossil fuels. The, what color is this? Brown is the agriculture, forestry, or other land uses. And this yellow is this BECS, this bioenergy carbon capture sequestration. So in this scenario, which doesn't require very much BECS, it's a great scenario, it's a radical change in behavior. That's the only way they could get these models to have a low CO2. So basically, all of us in this room, no driving, no flying, you know, no vegan, no buying anything, okay? And the whole planet, okay? It's a radical change in behavior, all right? It might be hard to do. We could do it. So anyway, this one is hard but possible, okay? This one, you know, we don't quite turn the CO2 around so quickly here from the fossil fuel emissions, and we need a ton of BECS. Okay, not just a ton, we need a lot of tons of BECS. We need to be, have the same infrastructure that we have today, you know, where we're emitting all this CO2 the cheap way, just emitting it like crazy. We need to have that same infrastructure sucking down CO2. Okay, that's why it's so hard. I mean, it is just an immense amount of CO2 we have to be removing in order to keep it to 1.5. So this is where the trade-offs might be, you know, it's expensive, and environmentally we might be like, I don't know, you know, do we really want to do that? And then you think about developing countries, okay, and whether they want to use what little land they have instead of for food security for bioenergy carbon capture and sequestration, which might be more expensive, right? I mean, trying to get poor people who don't have access to energy to not get energy, that's going to be a hard sell. Let's put it that way. So the other part of the report was to try to strengthen the global response and try to motivate people to do more on this issue. And think about that with sustainable development. So again, here we're trying to look for the synergies and identify where the trade-offs are, but look for the synergies and try to think about all the co-benefits. Like I said, you switch off of fossil fuels to sustainable energy and your air quality is much, much better. You use some of these methods for sequestering carbon in the soils, and your agriculture gets more productive and more resilient. You know, there's a lot of positives. Let's go for those as much as possible. We need a mix of measures to adapt also to climate change. I mean, that's the thing is we're not going to solve climate change without some increase in temperatures, and we need to make it so people are adapting correctly to climate change and not in ways that just make things worse. Okay, so again, you got to think about how to adapt. For example, if we all go out and buy air conditioners, you know, we're making the problem worse. But we're going to start getting worse summers here, okay? So how can we deal with that in a way that doesn't make the problem worse? We need national, subnational, civil society, private sector, indigenous peoples, and local communities all working together to address the climate change, okay? And so this is where we need this group working on this issue. We also need international cooperation. I mean, like I said, you got to have the developed countries getting the new technologies, getting them cheap, deploying them, figuring out all the bad things that can happen, working that out, and then getting it to the developed, sorry, did I say that wrong? Get the developed countries like us, get the technologies, and then get it cheap and give it to the developing countries, okay? This is what has to happen. There has to be the international cooperation. Like I said, there was a lot of work in this report to talk about what the trade-offs could be. Like I said, if the new energies are expensive, are more expensive than fossil fuels, you know, it's going to be hard to expect a developing country to not emit. You know, they want energy. You've got energy-starved people. You know, you're not going to get them if you can't get the energy down to the same price as fossil fuels, which, you know, we're there, right? Some of these things we have. We just need to start to deploy them out. So I just want to summarize and say, you know, we're at 1 degree C, warming already. We already are seeing the consequences of climate change. It's not impossible to be under 1.5, but it's really hard, okay? It's very ambitious. We have to move to sustainable energy right now. We have to have behavior change. You know, we got to stop using as much energy as we do. And really work on the agriculture as well. The food issue is really important. And land use, right? We need to allow reforestation. We need to stop sprawl, all these kind of agricultural areas. We don't have substitutes. We have substitutes for energy. We don't have substitutes for land. We need to move to sustainable ag. And we need to develop new carbon dioxide removal technologies because the current technologies have so many negative impacts and they're quite expensive. We're going to have to adapt to whatever level of climate change we're going to have. We just need to be thinking about the future. There's no way we can solve it without that. It's too late, right? We've got the whole economy moving in a certain direction, and we're going to try to switch it over, but it's really likely we're going to see quite a bit of climate change. The report really tries to identify the potential trade-offs between climate action and sustainable development, okay? And we want to avoid the trade-offs. But the report really works on the synergies between climate action and the other goals and trying to point out that we can benefit ourselves today even though we're thinking about, you know, what's going to happen in 2100. Now, I'm actually a very optimistic person, and people tell me this is a very depressing talk. But it is optimistic. I mean, there's so many new technologies right now, and there's quite a bit of energy in solving climate change. You know, 5 years ago, I was telling everybody it's 4 degrees. It's over. It's 4 degrees, okay? And now I'm saying, hey, it's 3, and maybe we could go lower, okay? So we have to keep working. I mean, the world has a lot of problems, and climate change is one of them, okay? But I'd say eradication of poverty is a big problem, and you know, there's a lot of other issues as well. And thinking about sustainable development and this whole big picture of what's going on, and trying to find the places that, you know, the synergies, the easy ones, let's do those first, and let's think about trying to get as low a CO2 emissions as we can. And that's how we should really be looking at the problem. And like I said, 3 degrees is a lot better than 4.5. And maybe with the energy that's being generated from this report, we can get a little farther. Like I said, the scientists were like, why look at 1.5? That's not going to happen. But I think the policymakers were onto something, that it really points out to people that, within 12 years, we're going to be seeing 1.5. And, we need to act now. That's the important thing. The longer we go with all this infrastructure that emits so much CO2, that the harder it's going to be to solve the problem. So they added this sense of urgency to the problem. And I think, I'm very hopeful that we'll get the new technologies and we'll get them deployed so we can really keep the climate targets low. That's my goal. Thank you.